Ma chudan agus ha mi geri fáilte chur gach duine an áráide agus Roderick McDonald tor shachad. So welcome everybody. I'm delighted to invite you all to Dr. Roderick McDonald's talk. He's an independent scholar with an interest in Old Norse and the Celtic languages. He has a raft of honorary appointments in the universities of Swansea and Nottingham. He now lives in Sheffield, and he is known for his interest in arts, public performance, crafts, and he runs a arts performative collective called Emu Forge. So some of you might like to check that out also. However, we're here for an academic talk today, and he's going to talk on the topic of between past and present word and deed dictionaries at the margins. And this talk has been recorded, and the process is that Roderick will deliver a lecture first, and then we will have questions. So if you want to put your questions in the comment or chat function, we'll read them out afterwards, and Rod is kind enough he'll be kind enough to answer all those when he's ready with his lecture. So Rod, may I invite you to talk on the topic? Thank you.
And thank you for those kind words, although I should warn people that if they go looking for Emu Forge, they won't find much because it's still very formative and doesn't even have a web presence yet, but hopefully soon. And thank you to Joe and the UHI for inviting me to give this seminar. It's obviously goes without saying how important these online events can be, in particularly these last 12 months when we've been thrown into a very strange world. I'd like to start with some context. What we see on the screen here are a number of images, and all but the landscape of photos taken in the National Museum of Ireland. Today, I'll mostly be talking about loanwords and dictionaries, and the reason I have these images here, including the picture taken from the Malade to Armadale Ferry, is that all of these objects have Gaelic and/or Irish names which come from Norse. Indeed, this is actually a very small subset of such items, and you could create quite a picture book from this sort of material. In a nutshell, these images represent real-world social and cultural contexts that have driven this research. They are everyday, ordinary and domestic words and objects, and they link us with the past. The objects and the words for them reveal the very domestic level at which interactions between Scandinavian and Gael unfolded, and they also showcase the role and the relevance of loanwords in helping us to better understand the people and the cultures that used them at the time. The items add flesh to linguistic evidence. Dictionaries are social constructs. They try to fit order onto what looks chaotic, and they are underpinned by a grammar that tends to explain vast amounts of variation, and they suggest a genealogy which seeks to anchor us in a theorized past. All of this is about mapping what we do and say and what we did and said into an overarching scheme and a temporal continuum, but they are accretive documents, they're metatexts, they are compilations that build a linguistic world out of dispersed atoms, and they're only ever partial as describers of linguistic behavior. The Irish lexicographer Chris Mulhall, and I'm not sure if I pronounced his name correctly there, in his 2018 article in the International Journal of Lexicography, described languages as permeable and noted that they have an intolerance of lexical deficiencies, and that a common mechanism to address an internal linguistic gap is to borrow a lexical item from another language. He also noted that these borrowings will become conventionalized, where they are no longer new, no longer transient, and so they ultimately offer functional stability for the language. Thinking in such terms about the images I showed you at the start, the words for them are known and still in use, partly because of such functional stability. This is both stability of language and stability of culture. My talk today will be divided, I just got rid of the page, My talk today will be divided into three parts. Firstly, I will describe the journey I've taken in coming to grips with the Norse loanwords in the Gaelic languages. And along the way, I'll discuss a couple of examples of the etymological challenges that I've faced. Then I want to talk a little bit about dictionaries, what they are, what they do, and what they might mean for us. And finally, I want to think about the wider implications of loanwords and historical lexicon, and think about how we might be able to connect this to what we think about the past and what we do with it in the here and now, in the present. Norse loanwords first came to my attention in my undergraduate degree at Sydney University in the late 1980s. This evolved into a PhD that I completed in 2009, and in this work I had a first go at compiling a lexicon of the Norse loanwords in the Gaelic languages. My overarching aim was sociological rather than linguistic, to attempt to understand the sociolinguistics of these words, to explain their presence in the borrowing languages. Why were they borrowed? How were they borrowed? And what might these borrowings tell us about the people who use the words? As might be expected, a large part of that work was in the data collection, and my search for words led to a large number of works by some of the great 19th and 20th century Celtic and Germanic philologists, lexicographers, and linguists. And while these scholars were exemplary in their collection and annotation of probable loanwords, I was struck by the overall inadequacy of the analytical research. And of course, I'll just pass making any comment on the sartorial and other elegance of these people. None of these no one in this analytical research seemed to know or admit to just how many loanwords there were, not even in very broad terms. Were there 50, were there 150, were there 500? And almost all of the scholarship assumed a common sense direct and numerical correlation between Norse loanwords and the extent of influence of the Scandinavians, or worse still, the extent of influence of the Vikings. Even some of the more noteworthy linguists and historians in the latter part of the 20th century were caught up in this. For example, both Magna Oftedal in 1961-2 and David Green in 1976 rehearsed the truth that there were not many Norse loanwords central to the language. Rather, they were technical in nature. I struggled to find where this notion came from. Certainly the technical nature of subsets of loanwords was recognised back in the 19th century by people such as William Craigie. But as far as I'm aware, back then or since, nothing has been done to explain how most loanwords were necessarily technical in meaning. Likewise, in 1983, notable Scottish scholar and lexicographer Derek Thompson and his companion to Gaelic Scotland recited similar views and suggested that the extent of Norse loans in Scottish Gaelic was due to some technological superiority in matters of boat building, sailing and fishing. And again, Scottish historical geographer Charles W.J. Withers in 1984 took the view that these loanwords were surprisingly few in number, and UHI's own Barbara Crawford, back in 1987, declared that a few Norse words had become permanent loans in Gaelic, no doubt reflecting what was then considered to be the accepted view. But here again, we are faced with a looseness in terminology and a dearth of linguistic theory. What is permanence in linguistic usage? When pushed to it, no word is permanent in any language. And how is a loanword to be considered if it is not established within linguistic usage, even for a comparatively short period of time? As we have already noted, loanwords are by definition conventionalized borrowings, and they provide functional stability in a language. Now, even David Stifter, the current professor of Old Irish at Maynooth, as recently as 2020, stated in his video presentations on Old Irish that Norse loanwords have narrow semantic focus in Irish, more so than Scottish Gaelic, and he further states that Norse had a profound influence on Scottish Gaelic, while there are but traces in Irish, largely restricted to some specific semantic fields, especially in seafaring and commerce. And 2 days ago, I came across another, which I didn't make it onto the screen. Catherine Swift, in her 2015 article, quotes Gillian Fellows Jensen in 2001, stating that there are only about 20 Norse loanwords in common use in Irish. And this view seems to be traceable back to David Green in 1976. But there is certainly much more to it than this. And it's now quite clear that all along scholars have been making assumptions based on common sense, which in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but the underlying assumptions have seldom been problematized. And the assumptions of old have grown to become truths. Now, it is readily apparent that in order to understand the presence of loanwords it is necessary to understand what happens when speakers of one language come into contact with speakers of another. In such circumstances, language change happens in part due to a whole bunch of accommodations and adjustments taking place to assist with communication. This is the functional stability that loanwords help to enable. And importantly, the speakers of both languages play a part. While a Norse speaker might be bringing new words to the Gaelic speaker, the Norse speaker is also learning Gaelic, and vice versa. Thus, the Gaelic speaker can be the native speaker, it can be the Norse immigrant for whom Gaelic is a second language, and the Gaelic speaker can also be one of among subsequent generations arising from Norse immigrants who are probably bilingual at some stage anyway. And all of these real world situations impact on the way the language is spoken. Moreover, the Gaelic speaker, whether culturally or ancestrally Norse or Gael, is likely to have been involved in the activities to which the Norse words refer. The mariners using the maritime loanwords were Gaelic speakers. And as noted, it is likely they were bilingual for both code switching, using two different languages within the one utterance, and bilingualism play varying and important roles in the linguistics of human interaction and in the borrowing of loanwords. So it cannot just be simply a matter of Scandinavians, or Vikings even, as agents of linguistic change. Indeed, we also need to recognise that speakers aren't necessarily aware of the language boundaries as in the same way that we might be. And those who are code switching aren't necessarily conscious of their switching between languages mid-utterance. So how many loanwords were there, or are there? My PhD revealed somewhere between 450 and 480 likely Norse loanwords in the Gaelic languages, and a further 170 which are possible but remain uncertain. Of this 620 to 650 odd, approximately half are exclusively in Scottish Gaelic, and around a sixth are exclusively in Irish. But somewhere around a third of these are or were found in common in both Scottish Gaelic and Irish. This means that there are somewhere around 550 such words in Gaelic and around 320 in Irish. Also, I should note here that for Manx, there appear to be fewer than 60 loanwords, and only a very small number, maybe 3 or 4 of these, are exclusively in Manx. So, and pretty much all of these are included in the numbers I just recited. I have discussed these in a chapter in the recent Routledge volume, Britain and Its Neighbours, edited by Dirk Steinforth and Charles Rosier. Just published 2 weeks ago, and I think I might have put on my references at the end of this presentation. On top of all these, there's also another set of words that I haven't included here. There's about 170 loanwords were identified as possible in the scholarship over the years, but my provisional assessment is that they don't look likely to be so, mostly for etymological and for phonological reasons, and some scholars seem to have had a little too much imagination from time to time. And doubtless some have been influenced by an underlying 19th century sense of nationalism. Now, interestingly, when one breaks the loanwords down into broad semantic groups, we find marked differences in the extent to which they are shared between Irish and Scottish Gaelic, or exclusive to one or the other. Seabird loanwords, for example, of which there are about 25, are almost exclusively found in Scottish Gaelic. But loanwords for tools and manufacturing, approximately 50 terms, about half are shared across both Irish and Scottish Gaelic. Loanwords relating to fishing equipment, approximately 12 words, as 7 of those are shared terms, but 16 of the 35 loanwords likewise are shared for maritime environment, or almost half once again are shared. But when we look at non-maritime topographical terms, there's 53 loanwords, 80% of those are in Scottish Gaelic. And even from such a high-level summary, without drilling down to the specifics of each word, we can see that these are not necessarily going to be a small set of words restricted to specific narrow technical semantic fields. And also you can start to see some hints of social, cultural and geographic implications. Why, for example, are so many of the non-maritime topographical terms to be found in Scottish Gaelic, and terms for tools and manufacturing so shared? And you can ask many questions of this set of words. Now, lexical work is first and foremost descriptive. So when we differentiate between Irish and Scottish Gaelic vocabulary, we appear to be describing two distinct languages, but the distinction is not that simple. And I'd just like to offer a few thoughts about issues relating to the differences and similarities among the Gaelic languages. The divisions between the three grey zone for sure, and especially when considering historical, social and political circumstances. Over time, geographical divergences undoubtedly arose between the languages, and it's a methodological challenge to parse these, especially when the time frame is so broad. Importantly, it's beneficial to consider the scope for looking at the differences as occurring across a variety of continua, whether those continua might be phonological, with the sounds or the grammatical forms, or in meaning in terms of semantics. And just as a couple of examples, Donald P.O. Boyle in 1979, who, considering the phonetics of the Gaelic languages, suggested there was at one time a linguistic continuum stretching from Cape Clear, which is the southernmost point of Ireland, to Sutherland, and with the Gaelic dialects of Mull, Islay and Arran sharing features with the northern half of Ireland. And T.F. O'Reilly's 1932 study of dialects of Irish reached a similar conclusion. Likewise, Colm O'Boyle argued against treating the Gaelic languages as separate entities, but that they are better considered as dialects or as languages with significant commonalities. He noted that such separation gives rise to the mistaken idea of mutually exclusive polarity of Irish versus Gaelic. Now, language is political, we know that. Unavoidably, we'll work within a modern geopolitical framework, and this in particular needs to be understood when talking about linguistic evidence from modern Scottish Gaelic and medieval Irish in the same breath. The fact that any records of medieval Scottish Gaelic usage might be indistinguishable from Middle Irish is simply something that needs to be embraced. For outside of modern dictionary attestations and modern spoken usage, at best the records we have are pretty much manuscript-based and of a classical, learned and shared Gaelic, which nevertheless might reveal some regionalisms. And by modern, I mean from the era of printed dictionaries, the earliest Irish being 1732 and the earliest Scottish Gaelic dating from 1741. And then on top of all this, there are the place names, and I'll return to them shortly. But in a sense, while lexical information has to identify usage across these linguistic divides, in many ways it has to be considered advisory rather than exclusionary. And of course, it's widely recognised that the DIL, the Dictionary of Irish Language, is an inclusive embracing geographically and temporally dispersed Gaelic usage over many centuries. Okay. In 2014-2015, I reviewed around a quarter of the loanwords identified in my PhD, and these were published in volume 62 of Zeitschrift für Keltische Philologie of 2015. While this piece of work certainly was an improvement on what I had previously done, I realise now, with the benefit of hindsight, that it could have still been done better. For each possible loanword, there are a set of questions. How is the phonology of the modern form to be derived from the attested, i.e. medieval Norse? What are the assumptions about sound changes, for example, that underpin the derivations? Question 2, having identified a possible loan, are there any grammatical issues that favour or undermine the proposed derivation? Thirdly, are there any historical Gaelic or Celtic cognate forms that might better explain the word's etymology? And are there other possible loan sources, English, Scots, Dutch, Norn? Are these going to be mutually exclusive of each other? And are there any social or cultural issues that might support or undermine the loan, or lead us to think differently about the word? Do the semantics make sense? Are there any implications relating to regional variation? Is the actual loan word attested, and is the actual source word attested? But, and this is a serious consideration, when we're considering a possible loan word, there is a real danger of circularity, for we are looking for possible phonological, morphological and grammatical explanations for its form. But we have to be careful that we aren't just selecting the specific factors that support the case we want to make and ignoring contraindicators. Now, I'd like to show you how this plays out and look at a couple of examples of possible loanwords. And these are both rather challenging ones, but for each reasons. I will actually skip over them quite quickly, so you do not need to worry about the detail in particularly the phonological section. Okay, firstly, scarce attestation with other possible sources. When you look at this word margalone, as you can see, Dwelly incorporated in his dictionary as an attested Gaelic term. Indeed, he cited this manuscript as his source. We don't know the scribe or the compiler of the manuscript. It's a dictionary. It's datable to 1823, but its provenance is not firm. All that is known, it was bought by a Donald Gregory in Edinburgh at the sale of late Sir William MacLeod Bannatyne's library in 1834. It eventually found its way to the library at the West Highland Museum at Fort William, where it currently resides. The text was undoubtedly compiled at a time before 1823, since the extant manuscript looks to be a fair final copy, but even in the manuscript you can see this word is in a different hand, added later by someone else, and we have no idea when or where this might have happened, or how much later than the primary hand. Moreover, this appears to be the only attestation of this word in Gaelic. Also, we have another word that looks like it might be related. The Gaelic word margal also means cod, according to the Reverend Neil Mackay, who reported it to the Gaelic Society of Inverness in 1897. Excuse me. He suggested it might be derived from Norse. He didn't specify the word, but it is clear he was thinking of margal, a term for a cut of meat, flesh, or flesh of the belly, which is attested in late medieval Icelandic manuscripts. But nowhere else, as far as I can find, are either of the words margalan or margal attested. Perhaps the longer term, the three-syllable word, is the same as a two-syllable, but with the diminutive ending, the an ending, which is a diminutive form in Scottish Gaelic. However, there are also two possibly related Gaelic words, one in modern Irish, mara, a small fish or bait, which also appears to have been used in Scottish Gaelic, and Irish magalan, which looks very close, meaning a fool. We also have the perhaps related word for testicle in both Irish and Scottish Gaelic, magerla, with the plural in Gaelic being magerlan. And if this is a variant of that, then the loanword may be on shaky ground. Now here's the clincher, and a salutary reminder of the need to take into account semantic change. Until a month ago, I had assumed the term cod, as used in the manuscript, and whoops, go back, as used in the manuscript and by Dwelly and Mackay referred to the fish. I mean, why not? There are a number of other fish terms among the loanwords. But as it turns out, this is probably not the fish after all. A brief look at the OED shows that the English term refers to a seed, a husk, a sac, a scrotum, or a testicle, hence the English term codpiece. So perhaps the Scottish Gaelic need not be looked at as a loan at all. The relationship, if any, and the semantics of all these Irish and Scottish Gaelic words need to be understood in considering these terms as possible loanwords. So second example, in looking at sound changes. The sound change is obviously very important in trying to explain the origins of a Gaelic word, but likewise, phonology might not necessarily resolve the issue. Indeed, it might well just muddy the waters even further. The word here is clearly related to maritime activities, which in and of itself tends to support a Norse milieu for its existence. Excuse me. The Reverend Dr. George Henderson, lecturer in Celtic at Glasgow University, in 1910 suggested that the Scottish Gaelic Loanword was from Old Norse Flavhammervik or Flathberg. And Alexander McBain picked up on this in the 1911 edition of his etymological dictionary, agreeing that the Norse source was Flavhammer. Unfortunately, neither explained their thinking. Taken at face value, this looks fairly straightforward. The meanings are very close, and the usual quality of scholarship of both McBain and Henderson can be pretty good. So on balance, this seems a fairly decent proposition, and in my 2009 PhD thesis, I accepted this as a likely loan and moved on. But when I came to reviewing it for the ZCP article in 2015, I revised it to uncertain. Upon review, I found it hard to account for all the sound changes needed to get there. And comparing with other loanwords, it seemed to me that it might have been more likely to expect something like labrug without the palatalized central hiatus sort of bit. But when I looked again recently, I came up with a different result. What you see here are possible intermediate stages between the Norse and the Gaelic. And without dwelling on too much, I'll just briefly describe it. Well, we actually have two possible versions here. McBain suggested Llav Hammer, while Henderson added the Old Norse Vic, meaning bay. And this ending certainly correlates better with the modern Scottish Gaelic second syllable ick. And the development might have been something like this. The initial H is lost twice. The Norse sound represented by the eth, that's the D with the stroke through it, the fricative the. The Norse sound, which isn't in Gaelic, becomes a d, which in turn becomes lenited and then ultimately evolves to a kind of hiatus between syllables. In the meantime, we have syllables disappearing through syncope and vowels adjusted accordingly. Now, these are all fairly standard linguistic phenomena, but there is a lot going on here, and I find it rather messy. Now, when we look at the other suggested source, which is Hlathberg in Old Norse, it's come quite clear that some sound changes might account for the form. Also, this proposal also may account for the modern Scottish Gaelic word. Once again, we have the loss of initial H, but in this case, the EV-B cluster is perhaps reanalyzed, becomes presumably lighted to a vert sound, then perhaps reanalyzed to a wert sound, and becoming a Scottish Gaelic hiatus between syllables. And alongside this, the epenthetic vowel inserted into berg becomes berg, and we have syncope of the syllable, so the et disappears from berg. And the vowels again all adjust themselves almost as if by magic. And of course, historically and modern vowels and diphthongs are terribly slippery things. But as you can see, there are indeed many steps and assumptions in both these possibilities, and while it seems very likely the Gaelic is from Norse, the actual source is obscured through time, and any reconstruction will be founded on best guessed options. And I think this now has to be classified as a likely loan, so it's gone from back to being likely, but with an obscure origin. And I think the second option is preferable because it is just a little simpler, applying Occam's razor. But that doesn't preclude something else as the origin altogether. And keep in mind that berg section, because we come across berg later in my paper. Okay, if we survive that little intense moment, we'll move on to what was going on. I mean, back in half a century ago, actually, the professor of Celtic linguistics at the University of Oslo, Magna Oftedal, outlined the key issues that constrain our ability to marry Gaelic words with Norse originals. Firstly, he described the linguistic context, and that is that Norse was spoken for probably more than 500 years in parts of Scotland and the Hebrides. In the 9th century, Gaelic and Norse were both fairly homogeneous or homogeneous, depending on your preference, but dialect differences likely developed in ensuing centuries, and contact between the two languages is likely to have influenced these divergences. Norse that was spoken in Scotland was also likely being influenced by Gaelic, and possibly even by that big unknown, what we think of as the pre-Gaelic language, Pictish. The influence of Norse upon Gaelic was likely to have been strong in places, governed by such things as a numerical ratio of speakers of different languages, of social prestige of either language, the amount of bilingualism, and the date and duration of Norse presence or Norse dominance. There was no necessary substitution of a Gaelic sound for a Norse sound. Some Norse sounds were not found in Gaelic, so a process of analysis and substitution came into play, and this could be complex. And we saw the loss of the initial H as an example there. In communities where there were high levels of bilingualism, borrowed words may have developed differently to Gaelic words, and some Norse loanwords probably into Gaelic via English and/or Scots. Oftedal also set out the linguistic correspondences that provide some pretty sound guidance for the assessment of Norse words in Gaelic, and the examples I discussed above reveal a number of these. Both languages had stress on the first syllable, and this shows up in the loanwords. Gaelic and Old Norse both had phonemic opposition between long and short vowels, and that simply means that the difference in vowel lengths was meaningful. So a long vowel, short vowel sound actually was a different, was effectively a different letter. And this is relatively well preserved in stressed syllables, both in Gaelic and in Norse loanwords. Whereas in unstressed syllables, they became more or less reduced. Short vowels were reduced to the neutral schwa, which is the sound. Sometimes the short vowel was raised and fronted to an it-like sound under the influence of a powerful consonant. Some short vowels disappeared altogether, and some consonants have been dropped. And the common Scottish Gaelic epenthetic or svaravacti vowel shows up in Norse loanwords. So we saw that in berg, the insertion between the R and the G. Gaelic opposition between powerful and non-powerful consonants was not known in Old Norse, but can be found in Norse loans. So Norse loans became accommodated to Gaelic phonetics. And there is also a correspondence between Gaelic but and gert with put and kut in Old Norse. Metathesis occurred, which is basically the swapping of the order of consonants. It wasn't infrequent, and particularly where Norse consonant cluster wasn't common to Gaelic, it could be swapped around to match Gaelic expectations. and there were very commonly Gaelic suffixes were added to Norse words. But Magna Octodale also sounded a warning that no list of regular correspondences, however elaborate, is sufficient or adequate for the reconstruction of Norse place names or other loanwords in Gaelic. Although no changes have taken place haphazardly, so many factors of time, place, and linguistic data are involved that no single list could do justice to them all. I think that's code for saying often we just cannot know. But I also should point out at this point that alongside the tricky loanwords, there are also many that are much simpler, more straightforward, and more clearly explicable than the examples I have given. So there we have it. The fundamental uncertainties of the work, perhaps of the words, of this work, of the words on the edge between the past and the present. We have looming darkness of 5 centuries of poorly recorded linguistic usage. It's now perhaps 700 to 800 years old. We have dispersed and variable interactions and behaviours across markedly different geographic and semantic domains, ranging from the early 19th century Viking Age Ireland to the dispersed rural communities under the latter stages of the Lordship of the Isles in the 13th century. And our evidence is only inscribed in surviving serendipitous and disconnected forms in a small amount of text, in place names, and in speech. So with that landscape now drawn, I want to discuss what this dictionary business might be all about. As far as my work is concerned anyway. Dictionaries are curious beasts, and pretty much anyone who is or was a lexicographer is not just a lexicographer. Indeed, seldom is there a lexicographer who is not something else first. A reverend, a linguist, a professor, an historian, a poet, a critic, a psychologist, a murderer, and so on. We even had Emperor Napoleon's nephew involved in the Oxford English Dictionary. And very rarely has anyone ever actually pursued formal studies in lexicography. There are good reasons for this, although it hasn't stopped an academic field of lexicography from developing. It's a bit like the lexicographers once were a village of merchants outside the city walls, and a village, like a village of word nerds, I suppose, outside the walls of academia, which the city or university inevitably accommodates, lays down the laws for, and taxes, lets some in and leaves others outside. Of course, the professionalisation of lexicography was inevitable, and it has been around a long time, but while useful and important, it possibly was never actually necessary. The Scotsman James Murray, the driving force behind the Oxford English Dictionary, was warned by Henry Sweet in Oxford of the dangers of letting Oxford get control of his dictionary-making efforts, and Murray remained an outsider to Oxford's college life till his death. On the other hand, the great Joseph Wright, the Oxford Professor of Comparative Philology, whose life would make a fantastic Netflix series, had to come up with his own funds for publishing his magnificent 6-volume English dialect dictionary in 1898 to 1905, a dictionary that really hasn't been bettered yet. Closer to home, Edward Dwelly, whose Gaelic English Dictionary of 1901 to 11 was described in 2012 by Willie Gillies and Lorna Pike as a major repository of Gaelic culture as well as Gaelic language, is another of the many that was published without institutional support. The field has form, has a long history of volunteerism and strength of individual character and interest. Nevertheless, dictionaries are necessarily to be judged against standards, and they rise or fall depending on how well they negotiate the demands of linguistic, semantic, and historical rigour. Typically, modern dictionaries are constructed around a dataset characterised by a sense of representative homogeneity, reasonably well-defined information about linguistic distribution and frequency, and based, and especially nowadays, on a linguistic corpus, a vast electronic searchable collation of text. And to be fair, many of these datasets are to be found funded and hosted by academic institutions. But it's not always an easy fit, and continuity of effort is never assured. The history of the Historical Dictionary of Scottish Gaelic and its later and current iteration, Fraught Gaelic, is testimony to the shaky ground that lexicography has occupied and continues to occupy. Now, my own small contribution to the field is, unsurprisingly, somewhat betwixt and between. And for many reasons, what I'm pulling together is not a standard lexicon, especially not by modern standards. I have a small data set that's not homogeneous. Rather, it's populated by a variety of source types and is diachronically dispersed across the millennium. I have no information about the extent of usage, whether the particular words were used widely or for how long. My timescales are vague and I have very little geographical information. And the fact that it brings together different languages also means that it is somewhat specialist in its construction. Primarily, though, what I think sets my word list apart is that it is gathered together purely for the purpose of offering a means for inferring the social circumstances of the words, how, when, and why these words appeared, as markers of shared usage among speakers of two different languages. And given that I'm attempting a reasonably extensive critical analysis for each loanword, what I'm putting together is perhaps better described as a close analysis of a small set of words that occupy the linguistic and geographic spaces shared between the speakers of two different historical languages. And then there's place names. Now, when we think about geographic spaces in which language users exist, we also think about locations, and from there it is but a short step to place names. Traditionally, lexicographers tend to corral proper nouns such as place names and personal names away from the rest of language as a separate set of words with their own terms and conditions. Certainly their linguistic nature is different, although it is fair to acknowledge that there are lexicographers who do consider proper nouns to be part of the lexicon. And even though place names might implicate a whole other set of issues, we also find in place names the same linguistic characteristics that are discussed earlier in relation to loanwords. UHI's own Professor Richard Cox has done considerable work in the field of Norse loanwords in Lewis place names. Broadly speaking, there are two types of place name loans. On the one hand, a place name in a given language might be taken into another language as a place name already in place, without the semantic contents of its original meaning being part of the loan. Simply a name that continues to be used. The River Avon is an example, which, as you presumably will know, etymologically, Avon is simply derived from an earlier Brittonic word for river. Semantically bleached and fossilized as a name for a place, it has become a specific rather than generic place name element. But we also find in place names a kind of morphological adaptation, new suffixes and the like, that Doctoral identified for loanwords, and these indicate that the name was likely not borrowed as a fossil, but as an active semantically functioning word in Gaelic speech, and then applied to the place name. The importance of this is that there are indeed examples of loanwords appearing in place names, where the place name is the only evidence that we have for the loanword. There is no other record of the word in use. This means, therefore, that the place name, or a component of it, is also a member of my lexical data set. Now, I'll just give you a quick example before I start to wrap up the talk. On the Isle of Lewis, we have a number of place names like Stacken Averig, Averig, there's two of them, and Ruin Averiga. Each of these contain the Norse word berg, meaning an elevated rocky piece of ground. The same word element that we had in the earlier example of the possible Old Norse Flavberg as a possible origin for Lowry, Scottish Gaelic Lowry. The fact that they all reveal elements of Gaelic grammatical form shows that the word was used as a Gaelic noun, and it is the grammatical treatment of the Norse word here that reveals it to be a loanword and not just a borrowed place name. So what does this mean? How do we relate dictionaries to people? When I set out, I was, in essence, motivated by an urge to explore nuances in the popular idea of the adjectival Viking. That is Viking Ireland, Viking Scotland, Viking Hebrides, and so on. And I hoped to gain a better idea of who these people were and what was going on, for it seemed quite apparent from the start that the historical mixed Norse Gaelic communities were not led by the term Viking. I hypothesized that linguistic remains could cast light on human social values, activities, and behaviors. Now, the mixing of languages is a clear marker of the mixing of peoples, and this mixing probably went on for many centuries. This isn't just about the so-called Viking Age or the popular misconception that the Vikings simply brought new maritime technologies, which they probably did, but they clearly brought more and much more developed as a result of the Scandinavians being there. This, to me, is a tale of travel and development, and sharing and expansion of experience and knowledge. It's a tale of settlement and trade between the Western Isles, the Island, the Isle of Man, Scottish Highlands and Northern Isles, Iceland, Faroe Islands, Scandinavia, the rest of Britain, and the continent. It's important to think about how the words happen, and the fact that the semantics of loanwords are multidimensional. They are dynamic and they are socially and culturally grounded, and many continue to be so to this day. When people who speak different languages go to the length of accommodating each other for the sake of communication, and this results in long-term changes to language, then the contact itself is likely to have been prolonged and motivated, stabilizing and potentially stable. Loanwords can be viewed from a number of angles. including in terms of the economics of of Scandinavian expansion and economic links with the rest of the world. Many of the loanwords that I have in my data set are directly implicated in travel and in trade. Not just technical words about ships and commerce, but words relate to, for example, preservation of food, which can be interpreted in a number of ways. Loanwords such as these might have come about from a language of shared subsistence living. We can see them on the screen there now. But similarly, that's a small selection. They might have arisen from the mere fact that portable preserved foodstuffs are important for sea voyages, or perhaps because they are also objects of trade. I mean, where do we go when you think about it to get these kinds of things, the beans, the bread, the sausages, and the dried fish? Do we go to the market or the shop? They're also Norse loanwords. Do we weigh the goods with the scales? Also a Norse loanword. Do you pay with a mark, a shilling, or a penny? Well, none of those now, but not, historically, yes. And what about the sausage words, the pudding words, marag and ishpen? Does this mean the Scandinavians introduced to the Hebrides the idea of stuffing meat scraps and miscellaneous questionable ingredients into animal tubes? We can't know that for sure, but the linguistics certainly suggests that as a possibility. In retrospect, it now seems so obvious that until there is a comprehensive lexicon, there cannot be any adequate or rigorous scholarship that discusses loanwords or uses loanwords as evidence, except perhaps for the most surface level of observations. And any recourse to loanwords as evidence will be based on incomplete data until then. And we need this data for both philological and linguistic purposes and for historical, geographic and sociological purposes. These words are about understanding nuances of history and hopefully about casting light where light has not hitherto shone or has not been very bright. They're about getting a look at the people who are using them. Of course, there are many other words we can look at in this light, and while these are words that ultimately derive from Old Norse, they are not Viking words, they are Gaelic. And when you think about these semantics, think about what I mentioned earlier, that these words are there because people of both languages were using them. So what does this mean in the big, wide, messy world in which we are playing? Alas, there is no simple answer. But perhaps we are indeed able to tidy this mess up a little bit. Dictionary writing is in part about trying to impose some order on the mess. But for me, dictionaries are also about really thinking about meaning and thinking about how the languages we use are so important for the world we live in. And personally, it's also about the joy we can take from the pedestrian, domestic, and everyday stuff. For even our most basic objects, activities, and relationships have genealogies that reach back into the mists of time and the mists of recorded language. The Gaelic languages have a rich history, and next time you eat black pudding, go to the market, or even tidy your room, think about the long history of these words and the long history of shared cultures from which we are so blessed to have benefited. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Rod. Very wide-ranging and engaging talk. Thanks a million. You covered there historical phonology, cultural contact, lexicography, place names, and some aspects of historical geography also. So I'm very grateful to you. Questions. And just as people are getting a chance to pose the questions in the chat function there, I see that Raggy has a question and a comment. I'll come to. If I could take advantage of being the chair today, could I ask a question about? I'm interested also in contact linguistics. Carol Myers-Scotton and her analytical approach. She talks of matrix languages and embedded languages. It's a power dynamic between two linguistic groups, and it's the power dynamics that somehow determines the type of philological and linguistic integration of loan words into a language. Have you thought about that analytical approach at all to your study?
I haven't had the opportunity to pursue that. I've come across it briefly. There are clearly different ways of envisaging the ways in which languages interact and people interact, and that sounds like, and from my sort of very superficial consideration, that it is a really useful way of understanding or trying to especially unpack the power relationships that may or may not subsist. I unfortunately I don't know enough about that to be able to offer any really well considered response to it, but I certainly is on the radar. Yeah.
Okay, we lost you there for a second, Rod, but I think we got the import of your comment.
Yeah,
thank you.
There's a bit of a lag.
Okay. I think we can continue anyhow. If I'll move to Raggy's comment. If you wish to say anything about this, Rod, she says in the chat function there, it might be interesting to find out whether the most common semantic fields of the Norse in the surviving Norn vocabulary in Insular Scots. So would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a good question, Raggy. The one of my go-tos for actually trying to clarify some of the more I suppose some of the lesser tested Norse words is actually to look at what's happening in the other Scandinavian languages, and the work of Jakobsen's work in Norn in particular is particularly useful. There is some commonalities. There are some commonalities. It's plural. But this seabird's a particularly interesting case. But I haven't actually done a sort of a measuring up of the two sets, and it's and I'm not sure the extent to which we'll be able to differentiate whether an Old Norse loanword in Gaelic can have come via Norn and maybe more recent, but there presumably would be the potential for phonological or other linguistic reasons to be able to reach some decisions on that. So whether in fact the influence has come from Norn rather than through the earlier medieval settlers is another question which needs to be, for each of the loanwords, needs to be unpacked. What can we know from the evidence we have?
Okay, thanks for that, Ron. Again, we're experiencing some technological difficulties, but I think we got most of your reply there. We'll see if we can plow on through anyhow. If I skip ahead to a question from Roger Auger, very positive comment, really enjoyed that, he says. Have you done any work on the rarer reverse process of Norse loaning from Gaelic, so the other way around?
Not to this detail. No, I'm aware of those opposite direction loans, and they are more problematic in a way, but partly because the attestation is a bit strange. You've got ergi written there. I'm aware of papa, but no, I haven't done that, and that's one of those things on that to-do list which I may never get to. So if anyone's happy to pick that up, I'd be more than happy for them to do it.
Okay, and Raggy is coming back there. She's saying she's, despite the problems, she's able to get the gist of the argument you're making. So it seems to be working. Okay. Yes,
sorry, just on that. Yeah, Raggy, I think that there's a good chance that might be it, where the okay, I'll look at that one.
Okay. While we're waiting for more to come in, you seem to want to offer some more advice to Fachlar na Gaelic, from your perspective. We just cut off that. We're back in.
Thank you.
Sorry about. Would you like to say some more about that? From your perspective, what advice would you like to give to the Fachlar na Gaelic project?
I wouldn't presume to.
I know that's a big question.
I wouldn't presume to be offering Fachlar na Gaelic advice. Indeed, I've been in touch with a couple of the people particularly in that trying to find that manuscript of the Magalan word. And yeah, no, I wouldn't dare to presume offering him advice. But I do think that I do think that the challenge for lexicography is always going to be, because it's a long-term project, and especially nowadays with the way in which the business operates, that you need to have, you know, sexy results to sell to the shareholders, essentially. And whoever those shareholders are, we don't know, presumably the senior management of universities. There's always a bind there. And I think that's, I think the way in which lexicography has tended to be at the margins is probably partly due to the nature of the work, that it has to be a long-term and very exacting commitment. And that doesn't match funding models usually. But yeah, no, fraught and the Gaelic, I think it looks like they've got an excellent, you know, opportunity to really establish something there. I look forward to seeing how it goes.
Okay, thank you for that, Rod. And we have another question from Sandra the Ricker. Forgive me, Sandra, if I'm not saying your surname correctly there. Are the social or material circumstances of such vocabularies at ever greater risk of loss because they are often harder to fully record in textual format? I wonder about the importance of also retaining visual and material information, like the side of everyday objects, the slide of everyday objects at the start, alongside the history of objects vocabularies. Would you like to address that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the key questions, is how do you ensure, I guess it's really my interest in the social and cultural context of linguistic behaviors. And when, for example, I suppose a good example might be the comparison when you look at Edward Dwelly's dictionary, at the illustrated parts, and the detail of, say, the parts that go into his description of the boat. When some of those are loanwords, but until you actually see the actual image of it, you can only describe it in inadequate terms. And so without the word being adequately embedded in social and cultural contexts, it is a lesser piece of evidence, a lesser piece of data. It's only data, it's not information. And the slide I set up at the start, when I said you could make a nice picture book of this, as soon as I wrote that down, I thought, right, I've just given myself a job, haven't I? Because I hadn't thought of it until then, but I realized, having set the pictures up, so the photos up, I realized there was a real scope there for giving these particular words some life. And you might recall that in those pictures of images, there was one of some shoes. That all those were most of those photographs from the National Museum of Ireland were from the Viking digs. And what struck me is that the shoe there was a child-sized shoe. And that is not just a shoe, but it tells a story of families having children living in that environment. And so that's the sort of social stuff which really was quite powerful, and which I suppose underscores the importance to me of really working through this material as closely and as detailed as I can.
Okay. Well, we're waiting there for a few more to come in. Can I ask this question about the relationship between technological innovation in the contact between different cultures, and then where the density of loanwords exists in languages? You said something about that in the talk. Maybe you want to elaborate a bit further on that. It's an interesting point in relation to material culture, I think.
It is. And McDonald was the one who specified the density of I suppose mixed populations having a stronger influence on potentially stronger influence on linguistic change. But in some ways, it's important to think of linguistic change as also being a marker of something else happening. It's like they didn't get together just so they could talk to each other. The loanwords and the linguistic change from interaction between different language groups is a result of the fact that the people were getting together. And I think historically this has been one of the problems with some of the older linguistic schools that they look at language as having agency, whereas realistically, the people have agency, and the language that comes out the other end is the result of that behaviour and those interactive behaviours. Regarding the technological stuff, I was brought to my attention just yesterday some work by I think Louise Sylvester or Heather Pagan in terms of Anglo-Norman in Middle English, and they've been doing some work on the technical language that comes from Anglo-Norman into English, and using that as what my initial impression of what they're doing. This may be misrepresenting them, but I understand that they're surprised to see the extent to which the technical languages in particular subfields of activity are perhaps indicating more Anglo-Norman speakers in those fields than they've had hitherto been thought. So I think it's a similar situation where you get a more intense interaction and it's socially productive, then you will be having some interesting stuff happening with both with language and with technological innovation. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for that, Rod. If we can return to Ragi's second question, we haven't had a question on place name. It's a mix of a comment and a question, I think. She's referring to your the few slides you had about Lamric, and she's, wow, I think that you might just have explained a Kirkwall place name I've struggled to understand for years, Laverock, as the inner end of the PDC, the Old Harbour. Could that be the same word? So do you happen to know that?
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. The only issue there is that if it's from the same word, then presumably that means that it was come through Gaelic, because the Norse would be Loveberg, and I'm not sure if would necessarily have changed to Loverock within and post Norn type of linguistics. So it's really does look like the same word, but we'd need to go through some of the historical terms and then try and work out when it was named that, and try and track it down. But that's the problem with place names. There's one of the problems that, like the problem I had with the problem we all have with these terms is they're not all well attested. But when you get to place names, sometimes they're too well attested, and there's so much variability.
Yes.
And so in a way, it's nice to be able to play in the fog rather than have to sort out all the mess. When the fog lifts, there's a huge mess there.
Yes. In the end, you have to go through the phonological change to be able to attest it, essentially. Yeah. Okay. Right. I think it's coming up to 2 o'clock. We like to finish within the hour to keep it as a lunchtime session. So again, Rod, just to thank you for, again, a very compelling and